So we've had 2 days of talks, Tuesday and Wednesday in Geneva, the third set of talks between Ukraine, Russia, United States mediators. But I think the most interesting report is not from unnamed sources. I think it's from President Vladimir Zelensky, because Zelensky spoke not just about a political group in the discussions, he spoke about a military group in the discussions. And what I found interesting is he talked about progress amongst the military group. Now, by that, I think he actually refers to the idea, which is, look, they were discussing how you monitor a ceasefire. And of course, we know that a ceasefire along the current front lines is essential in trying to end Russia's full-scale invasion. Zelensky's message indicated that there seems to be a working agreement that the U.S. will lead the monitoring mission. So the Americans will be involved in monitoring the ceasefire, but there is still the issue about whether Europeans will be involved in the mission to oversee the ceasefire, presumably because the Russians object to that. And the Russians have said quite clearly they do not want any European troops inside Ukraine. But at least we were getting progress technically in terms of what a ceasefire might look like. But that brings us to the political group, because you've got to get to a ceasefire. And there you quoted the unnamed officials who said that the discussions were stuck. But Zelensky also indicated that there had been very little progress on the political front. He did not name the Kremlin's chief negotiator, Mr. Medinsky. But what he said, I think, was even more interesting and more important, using a couple of rude words, because even though he is posting this on social media, you can tell he is frustrated. Zelensky said, "We don't need any more historical lessons from the Russians." And we know that Vladimir Putin and we know his officials like to go on long-winded historical explanations about how Ukraine is part of a greater Russia. It appears that Medinsky, instead of negotiating on the serious issues, such as the status of the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, such as the security guarantees for the rest of Ukraine, such as the fate of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, instead of actually negotiating on these issues, Medinsky simply went off on polemic, effectively restating the Kremlin's maximum demands. Politically, Ukraine should surrender to Russia. For that reason, whereas the talks were 6 hours or almost 6 hours on Tuesday, they were only 2 hours yesterday, and they ended earlier than we expected. Another sign that we really didn't get that much progress. Ukraine is saying we still would like to have a third round of meetings in February. Another round of meetings in February. We wait to see what the Kremlin says, but I think at least my expectations are being fulfilled. And that is, you can discuss the military arrangements for a ceasefire, but until the Kremlin gives up its maximum demands, and by that I mean seizing all of the Donetsk region, keeping the rest of Ukraine weak with no effective security guarantees, until the Kremlin thinks it can get those, we will not get progress in these negotiations, because the Russians do not come to the table to negotiate. They come to the table to get Ukraine to surrender.
You just mentioned about President Zelensky's statement. Also, President Zelensky told Axios that Ukrainians would reject any deal requiring them to give up the Donbass region to Russia. You also have pointed out and mentioned about some kind of technical progress in this military group, but how can we make any kind of progress without solving major issues and major divisions between both sides?
You can't. I mean, there's still a value to the talks on the military side, because, if we suddenly got a breakthrough, then the military arrangements are in place. You don't have to go through and discuss them after you suddenly get a ceasefire. So those talks are still valuable. But, politically, there's no movement here. There hasn't been movement politically with the Kremlin throughout any of these talks. Just as in the much vaunted talks in Istanbul back in 2022, in the spring of 22, that those talks fell apart because the Russians at the end of the day gave Ukraine another ultimatum. They changed the terms. So I think what was interesting about Zelensky's comments were not just saying that we can't give up Donbass without a referendum, which is true. I think it was also the comments that he made on Tuesday, which said, okay, we can't give up Donbass without a referendum. We're not going to give up the Donbass without a referendum. We're not going to give up Donetsk without a referendum, but we will withdraw. So we'll pull back our military forces in Donetsk, the 22% we control, provided the Russians withdraw from the occupied areas of Donetsk. In other words, here's Zelensky saying, look, we will establish a demilitarized zone. And the Americans quite often talk about a demilitarized free economic zone. Zelensky's saying, okay, we will do that. We will demilitarize here if the Russians do as well. But there is no indication from the Kremlin that they will accept that demilitarized zone. I just restate this. It's, for all the discussions on peace talks, what could happen, what the terms could be, if the Kremlin wants all of the Donetsk region, which is very strategic, and the Kremlin is not going to give up the demand for all of the Donetsk region, there will not be an agreement. Because Ukraine is not going to give up that fortified area. Its European partners are not going to accept giving up that fortified area. And Russia is not going to accept having only what it occupies right now.
There is a interesting shift in Kremlin because the source close to the Kremlin said to Western media that Russian officials like Steve Witkoff energy and positive tone there sometimes question how reliable he was, and he was not too new to the core US-Russia issues and initially brought no other American experts into talks, and more recently they welcomed Jared Kushner, citing his more structured and organized approach. So I'm really curious how significant is this shift in Moscow perception, and why is it happening now?
Oh, why are they having it now? Because they think that Witkoff is not the route to get the Americans to support their position. They think that they can flatter Jared Kushner and offer him economic deals, and that will be the key to the U.S. siding with the Kremlin on its maximum demands, including over Donetsk. Let's rewind this a bit. The Kremlin had no problem with Steve Witkoff showing up with no other American officials when he met Vladimir Putin last spring in the Kremlin. They were quite happy he didn't show up with any other American officials because they could try to manipulate him. They were very happy last October when they sent Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's top economic advisor, to Florida to work with Witkoff on this ultimatum to Ukraine, this 28-point ultimatum. But between late October and today, the Kremlin could not get the Trump administration to fully back its demands for Ukraine's surrender. And so what happened? A couple weeks ago, in between the various sets of talks that we had, first in Abu Dhabi, then in Geneva, the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, got upset with the Americans, and he lashed out at the Americans. And he said, the Americans are retreating from the agreement which we had with them at the summit last August. The meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Well, there was no U.S.-Russian agreement at Alaska last August. The Americans did not agree to the Russian demands. What the Russians had asked for at Alaska, however, was all of Donetsk. That's what they'd asked for. And they still hadn't gotten it. So it's like, okay, they don't respect Witkoff. Let's be honest here. They chose Witkoff based on psychological profiles because they thought they could manipulate a real estate developer. But when Witkoff couldn't deliver for them, who do they go to? They go to the next person they think can deliver for them. And when the Russians are talking about trillions of dollars in economic projects, and when Jared Kushner has an investment firm where he's hoping to get billions of dollars of contracts, as he has done from Gulf states in the Middle East, when you have a Trump family, which is trying to get billions of dollars of deals from all around the world, as we found out just yesterday through Eric and Donald Trump Jr., then the Kremlin thinks, Steve Witkoff, real estate developer, not that important. Jared Kushner would like to have billions of dollars behind his investment firm. He can be important.
Actually continue this logic of Russia is wanting to take all of Donbass and even maybe to catch up more territories. I would like also to quote European intelligence because according to them, European intelligence chiefs are pessimistic about a ceasefire this year, despite, as we know, Donald Trump saying talks have brought a progress. And senior officials, as Reuters quote them, believe that Russia does not want a quick end and using the US Ukrainian Russian talks to seek sanctions relief and to achieve new business deals with Americans. And one official called the latest Geneva talks, I quote, a theater, noting Russia's economy is not near collapse. And is actually Trump aware of the risk that Russia is just buying time and playing a game, or as officials called it, theater? And would tougher sanctions actually significantly damage Russia's economy if it's still actually able to produce something?
Donald Trump does not think logically about Ukraine and Russia. Donald Trump doesn't have enough information to think about Ukraine and Russia. Donald Trump thinks emotionally about Ukraine and Russia. And throughout this week, before and during the Geneva talks, Donald Trump emotionally was saying, Ukraine better make a deal. Ukraine better make a deal or else. Why is it Ukraine that should make a deal? Why isn't it the Kremlin that should make a deal? Especially when the Kremlin, hours before the Geneva talks, launched 29 missiles and almost 400 drones on Ukrainian civilian areas, including energy infrastructure. Why should it be Ukraine that should make a deal? That's just Donald Trump talking off the top of his head. And as we have discussed many times before, who are the other American officials who are involved here? Do they believe that Ukraine should surrender, or are they willing to accept that Ukraine's security is important? And that's where we are. But the broader point here from the European intelligence reports are the Kremlin is not going to compromise. We know that. So your open question, Sophia, is how long can the Kremlin maintain a full-scale assault in the air and on the ground? And what the Europeans are saying quite rightly is this continues for the foreseeable future. Vladimir Putin's not going to suddenly say, okay, I stop now. We'll hold what we occupy, but that's it. The Russian economy is slowing down. The wartime economy is slowing down. Oil revenues still remain about 50% below where they were a year ago. It has just been reconfirmed that India is taking its lowest level of Russian imported oil since late 2022. And that is Russia's second largest customer. China is still limiting purchases below the levels of last year. But as long as we have Russia able to get components, including from China, for its military, as long as they can run a wartime economy and get people to accept cuts in social spending while accepting increases in military spending, and as long as they can find manpower, they'll keep trying to fight. That's just the reality of it. It's a hard message if you're in Ukraine. I hate to say that. I know what you have to endure, but it's a realistic message. I just come back to this. The Europeans make their estimates. The Americans are unpredictable. Fundamental here is Vladimir Putin is fighting for his legacy. So he will not give up easily. But Ukraine is fighting for its existence. So however long we're talking about Russian attacks continuing through 2026, Ukrainian resistance is likely to continue. And so that doesn't mean the talks are unimportant. They're very important, but they're a bit of theater. The reality is support for Ukraine against the Russian invasion. So as well as just talking about the political talks, that means air defenses. That means equipment and weapons for Ukraine on the front line. It means the joint production projects, including the drone production projects that have been launched, and it means supporting Ukraine's counterattacks inside Russia. Hi, I'm Scott Lucas. Thank you so much for watching. If you like what you see, subscribe, spread the word, send ideas.